How the Apostle Paul went from persecutor of Christians to pillar of Christianity. There are moments when a single encounter becomes strong enough to rewrite a life. Moments when everything a person believes, protects, and builds suddenly collapses under the weight of a truth they never considered. Saul of Tarsus lived with an unshakable certainty. He walked with the confidence of someone who believed he understood God, defended God, and fought for God. His convictions were so rigid that he could not imagine he was standing on the opposite side of the very one he claimed to serve. But the soul has a way of trembling long before the body falls. Inside Saul, cracks had already begun to form. He watched men die with peace on their faces. He heard forgiveness being offered by mouths that should have spoken fear. He saw a joy in Christians that no prison could break. Something inside him reacted, as if a hidden part of his heart knew that the light he resisted was the only light he truly needed. This is the story of a man who was certain he knew God but had never met him. A man who believed he was strong but was held together by the fragile threads of pride, performance, and fear. At the center of Paul's story is not simply a conversion, it is a collapse, a breaking, a holy interruption. It is the moment when God stepped into the path of a man running in the wrong direction and, in love, brought him to his knees. Some people imagine the road to Damascus as a moment of judgment, but what happened there was an act of mercy so deep that it shattered Saul's identity to reveal the man God always intended him to be. And this is what makes his journey so powerful for us today, because every believer carries a little of Saul inside them. The part that fights for control, the part that fears being wrong, the part that hides behind knowledge, strength, or certainty, because facing our own emptiness feels terrifying. Yet God meets us not to condemn us, but to awaken us. Grace breaks the walls we build. Light invades the places we avoid. Blindness becomes the strange doorway to finally seeing. As we step into Paul's story, I invite you to walk slowly and listen with your soul. Let the silence inside these scenes speak to you. Let the questions rise. Have you ever held on to something so tightly that losing it felt like death? Have you ever mistaken conviction for truth and zeal for closeness to God? Have you ever been so sure of your path that you didn't notice heaven trying to interrupt you? Paul's journey reveals a God who steps into our certainty, not to punish us, but to rescue us. A God who allows the ground beneath us to break so that our hearts can finally open. A God who takes a persecutor and turns him into a pillar, not by force, but by love. And as you hear this story, open your spirit, because in the transformation of one man, God may be whispering the beginning of your own. A man who thought he knew God, but didn't. Saul walked through life like a man who believed he carried truth in his hands and fire in his voice. Every step he took was heavy with confidence, shaped by the certainty that he was defending the holiness of God. To anyone watching him, he looked unshakable, disciplined, righteous, even admirable. But the soul behind that certainty was not at peace. Saul's convictions were armor, forged layer by layer to protect him from facing the silence within. He clung to the law as a soldier clings to his weapon, convinced that if he followed every rule, if he punished every deviation, he would silence the unsettling questions echoing inside him. He mistook zeal for intimacy, authority for calling, and control for holiness. He believed that if he fought hard enough, he could drown out the possibility that God was moving in a way he did not understand. Inside his heart, though, a battle had already begun. He saw followers of Jesus dying without fear. He heard prayers spoken by voices that should have been crushed by terror. He witnessed forgiveness that contradicted everything he had been taught about justice. Something in him resisted these moments, yet something deeper was stirred by them. As if his spirit recognized a truth his mind refused to accept. He continued pressing forward, not because he was certain of his path, but because he was terrified of what he might find if he stopped. Saul was not only pursuing Christians, he was running from himself. And in his desperate chase for order, he grew blind to the one who was already calling his name. This is where the story becomes universal, because every person who walks with spiritual pride, emotional armor, or intellectual certainty carries within them the same danger Saul carried, the conviction that we are right even when we are far from God's heart. The greatest threat to spiritual growth is not doubt. It is false confidence. It is believing we know God so well that we no longer hear him. It is assuming our logic, our tradition, or our discipline is enough to replace a living relationship with the Holy Spirit. Saul thought he was defending God, but in truth, he was defending the prison he had built for his own soul. A prison made of knowledge without revelation, discipline without surrender, and zeal without love. There is a moment in every journey when God decides to intervene, not to shame us, but to awaken us, not to humiliate us, but to free us. Saul did not know he was walking toward the moment that would undo him. He did not know that the ground beneath his certainty was about to break. He did not know that heaven was already preparing a collision he could not escape. But God knew. And in that divine knowing lies the grace that changes everything. Because God waits for the precise moment when the human heart is fragile enough to crack, yet strong enough to receive truth. Saul believed he was hunting down danger, unaware that he was the one being pursued by mercy. As his feet carried him toward Damascus, his mind raced with purpose, but his spirit trembled with something he could not name. God was not angry with him. God was reaching for him. And the same God who interrupted Saul's path is the God who interrupts ours, especially when we are most convinced that we don't need interruption. This is where Saul's journey touches ours, because every believer faces a Damascus road, a moment when the light becomes too bright to ignore. A moment when God confronts us not with wrath, but with truth that pierces deeper than our pride. A moment when the voice of Jesus exposes how far we have walked from love and how desperately we need grace. And as Saul walked toward that moment, heaven had already decided that the man who thought he knew God would soon become the man who would teach the world what knowing God truly means. The inner Saul, the psychology behind a persecutor. Every outward action in Saul's life was shaped by an inward storm he refused to acknowledge. Saul did not wake up one day and decide to persecute followers of Jesus. His rage was not born overnight. It was rooted in years of pressure, expectation, identity, and fear. To understand Saul before Damascus, we must enter the geography of his inner world, the place where his certainty was built, not on faith, but on survival. Saul had been raised to believe that value came from performance. Every law kept, every tradition obeyed, every argument won, every reputation protected. His entire identity rested on being right. To lose an argument was to lose himself. To be wrong was unthinkable. This produced a mind constantly on guard, scanning for threats, terrified of losing the ground he had spent his entire life building. When the followers of Jesus began spreading a message that fulfilled the law rather than glorifying it, Saul felt the ground beneath him begin to shake. The more he saw Christians walking in freedom, the more enslaved he felt to the system he had mastered. Their peace exposed his unrest. Their grace exposed his striving. Their simplicity exposed his complexity. Without realizing it, Saul began to feel that their faith threatened not just the religion he defended, but the identity he depended on. His pursuit of Christians was not merely ideological, it was deeply personal. Their existence forced him to confront a terrifying possibility, one he was emotionally and spiritually unprepared to face. What if everything he built his life on was incomplete? What if God was moving, and he had not recognized it? What if the Messiah he waited for had already come, and he had missed him? These questions were too painful for Saul to even consider, so he buried them beneath layers of anger, discipline, and violent certainty. But suppressing a truth does not silence it. It only strengthens the internal pressure. Saul's mind entered a state of cognitive dissonance, the clash between what he saw and what he believed. He witnessed followers of Jesus dying with supernatural peace, yet told himself they were deceived. He felt a tremor inside when he heard Stephen's prayer for forgiveness, yet convinced himself it was weakness. He sensed something holy in the way Christians loved their enemies, yet hardened his heart to avoid the discomfort of admitting it. This is the psychology of a persecutor. The deeper the truth threatens the ego, the more aggressively the ego fights back. Saul was not driven by confidence. He was driven by fear disguised as authority. Like many who cling desperately to control, Saul believed that eliminating what challenged him would restore his inner balance. But the opposite happened. The more he fought the followers of Jesus, the more his inner conflict grew. Conviction without peace became a burden he could not escape. Religion without relationship became a chain he could not break. Zeal without love became a fire that consumed him from the inside. Saul appeared powerful, but his soul was exhausted. He was a man trying to hold together a life built on knowledge, intellect, and discipline, while the Holy Spirit gently confronted the emptiness at the core of it all. This is where Saul's story touches ours again. Because every person who seeks control, perfection, and certainty is secretly wrestling with fear. Fear of failing. Fear of being wrong. Fear of not being enough. Fear of losing what defines them. The persecutor inside Saul was not a monster. It was a wounded part of him fighting desperately to preserve the identity he had worked so hard to build. And God, in his mercy, was preparing to meet that wounded part. Not to crush it, but to heal it. Not to shame it, but to transform it. Saul's persecution of Christians was not a sign of strength, but of fragility. It revealed the cracks forming inside him, cracks God intended to widen just enough for light to enter. And as Saul tightened his grip on certainty, heaven began to loosen the grip of his heart, preparing the moment when truth would finally confront him, not through arguments, laws, or doctrines, but through the voice of the one he never expected to hear. The hidden crisis. The moment Saul started to break inside. Long before the light of Damascus knocked Saul to the ground, something inside him had already begun to fracture. Transformation never starts at the moment we fall. It begins in the quiet cracks that form beneath the surface, in the places no one sees, in the thoughts we push away, and in the emotions we refuse to admit. For Saul, this inner crisis began the day he witnessed something his doctrine could not explain. Stephen, standing before death, radiated a peace Saul had never felt, even in his most righteous achievements. Stephen's face shone as if he were looking into heaven itself, and when stones rained down on him, he did not curse, resist, or defend himself. He prayed, he forgave, he released love while receiving hatred. That scene entered Saul's mind like a seed he tried desperately to uproot, because nothing terrifies a rigid heart more than a truth it cannot explain. Saul wanted to forget that moment, but it followed him. Every time he arrested a believer, every time he heard them singing through blood and bruises, every time he watched them treat suffering as a doorway rather than a defeat, something inside him trembled. Their joy exposed his emptiness. Their courage exposed his fear. Their grace exposed the coldness that discipline had created within him. Saul thought he was destroying a movement, but he was actually encountering a kind of faith he had never known. A faith that was living. A faith that breathed. A faith that no sword, no prison, no threat could silence. And that kind of faith has a way of haunting those who resist it. The human mind can deny truth for only so long before the soul begins to collapse under the weight of the lies it tells itself. Saul repeated the same arguments, recited the same laws, and reaffirmed the same beliefs, not because he was convinced, but because he feared the consequences of questioning them. For someone like Saul, the possibility of being wrong did not simply threaten his theology. It threatened his identity, his status, his reputation, and the foundation of his entire life. That kind of pressure creates an internal fracture, the kind that grows quietly until a single moment causes it to split wide open. Deep inside, Saul felt that the God these Christians served might truly be moving. He felt the unsettling warmth of a presence he had never encountered in the rituals of the law. But instead of allowing that feeling to soften him, he hardened himself further. This is the tragedy of spiritual pride. When God whispers, it hears an insult. When God calls, it feels attacked. When God reveals, it retreats behind walls of certainty. Saul fought harder not because he was sure of his path, but because he feared the collapse of the life he built. Many people do the same today. They cling to a belief not because it brings them life, but because letting it go feels like letting go of themselves. But God is patient. God allows the heart to wrestle, tremble, and resist until the moment it is finally ready to break open. Saul's hidden crisis was not a sign of failure. It was a sign of divine pursuit. The Holy Spirit was already moving inside him, unsettling him, softening him, preparing him. Every moment of discomfort was grace at work. Every internal conflict was heaven knocking on the door of his soul. Transformation is not born in dramatic moments. It is born in the silent collapsing of things we once worshipped. Saul was already breaking long before he fell. His fall on the Damascus road was simply the moment when the breaking became visible. And this is where we must pause and reflect on our own lives, because many people are walking through a hidden crisis without realizing it is God preparing them for change. The unanswered prayers, the internal tensions, the questions that will not go away, the restlessness that grows inside the soul, all of these can be signs that heaven is drawing near. Saul's crisis was not a punishment. It was an invitation to let go of the identity he had built and embrace the truth he had been running from. An invitation to stop fighting what his heart already sensed. An invitation to discover a God who was bigger than his understanding and closer than his breath. Before Saul saw the light, he felt the cracks. Before he heard the voice of Jesus, his own conscience had already begun whispering. Before he fell to the ground, his soul had already begun kneeling. The hidden crisis is the mercy of God preparing the heart for the moment when truth will finally be impossible to resist. The collision with grace. Saul, why do you persecute me? There are moments in life when God stops whispering and begins to speak in a voice that shakes the soul. Moments when heaven interrupts our carefully constructed lives because love refuses to let us continue in the dark. Saul's journey reached this breaking point on the road to Damascus, a road he believed he was traveling with holy purpose. Yet every step he took was leading him toward a divine ambush, prepared long before he was even aware of his own need for rescue. The moment the light broke through the atmosphere, it did not simply shine. It consumed him, swallowed his certainty, and tore apart the version of himself he had spent years perfecting. A light so fierce that Saul could no longer remain who he was, and yet so tender that its goal was not to destroy him, but to reveal him. The collision with grace began not with accusation, but with a question that pierced deeper than any judgment ever could. Saul, why do you persecute me? It was not the voice of a distant God. It was the voice of the one Saul believed he was defending, the voice of the Messiah he had denied, the voice of love he had been trying to silence outside of himself, unaware that the true battle was inside his own heart. That question shattered Saul. Not because it condemned him, but because it exposed him. It revealed the truth he had spent his entire life avoiding, that faith without relationship is empty, that zeal without love is violence, and that knowledge without surrender is blindness. In that moment, Saul discovered something no one had ever told him. Every wound he inflicted on the followers of Jesus had touched Christ himself. Every imprisonment, every insult, every death, every attempt to silence the gospel was felt by the one he claimed to worship. Jesus did not confront Saul with a list of sins. He confronted him with himself, and that encounter was enough to dismantle every defense Saul had built. Grace does not begin with correction. It begins with revelation. When Saul asked, "Who are you, Lord?" he was not simply asking for identification. His soul was crying out for truth, for meaning, for the God he had sought but had never truly known. And when Jesus responded, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," Saul's entire world broke open. The force of that truth struck him harder than the light that blinded him. Blindness became the doorway through which his soul finally learned to see. His physical sight had to be stripped away so that the false clarity he depended on could collapse. The man who had walked with rigid certainty now faced the terrifying vulnerability of being led by the arms of others. The man who believed he could judge the hearts of believers now discovered he did not even understand his own. The man who tried to extinguish the light now found himself overwhelmed by it. And in that moment of divine confrontation, Saul learned the truth every believer must eventually face. Transformation begins where self-sufficiency ends. What happened on that road was not an act of wrath. It was an act of mercy. God chose to meet Saul at the height of his rebellion because grace is never afraid of the places where we hide. God does not wait for us to be ready. He steps into our resistance, breaks through our defenses, and reveals himself in ways we cannot ignore. Saul's collapse was not the end of him. It was the beginning. God was not punishing him. God was awakening him. And the same God still meets people this way today. Sometimes through silence, sometimes through struggle, and sometimes through a moment so overwhelming that the soul can no longer cling to the illusion of control. Saul fell to the ground because every false foundation inside him crumbled at once. His fall was both physical and spiritual, an outward sign of an inward collapse. But in that collapse, something sacred began. He surrendered. He asked the only question that matters when a person finally stops resisting God. What do you want me to do? And in that moment, the persecutor took his first breath as a disciple. The man who threatened believers became the man who would one day teach nations how to follow Christ. The collision with grace did not destroy Saul. It uncovered Paul. When heaven confronts you, it is never to end your story. It is always to rewrite it. The silent days of blindness. God's most unseen work. When Saul opened his eyes after the collision with the light, he saw nothing. The world that once felt sharp, defined, and controlled dissolved into darkness. This blindness was not a punishment, it was a holy surgery. God temporarily removed Saul's physical vision so he could reconstruct the deeper vision Saul never knew he needed. The man who had walked with confidence now stumbled with trembling hands. The one who believed he understood truth now had to depend entirely on the guidance of others. The one who judged believers as weak now discovered the fragility of his own soul. And in those 3 silent days, God did a work in Saul that no sermon, no argument, no law, no discipline could have ever produced. The silence that followed the encounter was heavy. Saul had built his identity around noise, debates, teachings, orders, arguments, structured certainty, and rigid belief. But now there were no voices left to affirm him, no rituals left to reassure him, no achievements left to hide behind. Without sight, he could no longer outrun his own heart. Without distractions, he could no longer suppress the truth he had been resisting. In the stillness of those 3 days, Saul came face to face with the very emptiness he had spent his life denying. The silence was not abandonment, it was preparation. It was the Spirit removing the old layers of pride, religious armor, and emotional walls so that Saul could finally receive what he had always needed but never sought: grace. Imagine the weight of those hours. Every memory of the believers he had hurt returned with painful clarity. Every face he had imprisoned, every cry he had ignored, every prayer he had dismissed. In the darkness, he could no longer distance himself from the consequences of his actions. He felt the heaviness of shame, the confusion of identity collapsing, and the fear of not knowing who he would become. But grace was already working beneath those emotions. Shame brings collapse. Grace brings rebirth. God was not crushing Saul. He was softening him, breaking the ground so that something new could grow. Saul refused to eat or drink during those days, not as a religious gesture, but because his soul was undergoing a transformation deeper than hunger or thirst. Human effort had led him into darkness. Now only divine presence could lead him out. It is in these moments of emptiness that God shapes people for purposes far greater than they imagined. The silence became a sanctuary, a hidden place where heaven whispered truths Saul had never been still enough to hear before. The absence of sight forced him to listen. The absence of action forced him to surrender. The absence of self-reliance forced him to trust. Many believers misunderstand these seasons of silence in their own lives. They interpret the absence of answers as rejection. They assume God has withdrawn when the truth is that God is working in the depths where words cannot reach. Blindness is often the beginning of clarity. Emptiness is often the beginning of transformation. Saul did not realize it yet, but the darkness he sat in was the womb of his calling. God was not delaying him. God was forming him. This is the mystery of divine timing. Heaven often prepares destiny in silence because the noise of life cannot carry the weight of revelation. During those days, Saul's heart shifted. His questions changed. His defenses fell. The man who once demanded certainty now accepted dependence. The man who once clung to the law now opened himself to grace. The man who believed he could see now understood he had never truly seen at all. This is the moment transformation becomes irreversible. When a soul finally admits its need for God, heaven begins to pour into places that were once closed. In the end, those 3 days were not about blindness, but about revelation. Saul learned that sight without truth is darkness, and blindness in the hands of God becomes the doorway to true vision. When Ananias would finally place his hands on Saul, the scales that fell from his eyes would not only restore his sight, they would symbolize the breaking of every false certainty he had ever carried. And in that awakening, Saul would rise, not as the man who entered Damascus, but as the man God destined him to become. In every believer's life, there are silent days. Days when God seems distant, when answers do not come, when clarity disappears. But often, those are the days when God is doing his most sacred work. The unseen work that shapes identity, heals wounds, softens pride, and prepares the soul for purpose. Saul's story reminds us that darkness does not mean absence, silence does not mean rejection, and blindness does not mean defeat. Sometimes God must turn off the lights so the heart can finally see. Ananias, the unknown hero who broke the cycle of fear. While Saul sat in silence, blinded and trembling beneath the weight of everything he had become, another story unfolded quietly in the background. A story that reminds us that God often builds the greatest transformations through people whose names the world barely remembers. In a small corner of Damascus, far from the noise of public events, lived a disciple named Ananias, an ordinary man whose faith was sincere, steady, and hidden. He was not a preacher, not a scholar, not a leader of crowds. He was simply a servant whose heart was open enough for God to speak and humble enough to listen. But when the Lord called his name, the message he received was the last thing he expected. He was to go to the house where Saul of Tarsus waited. The shock that flooded Ananias was not lack of faith, it was human fear. He knew Saul's reputation. He knew the destruction Saul had already caused. He knew the tears of the believers whose loved ones had been taken, and now God was asking him to step into the presence of the very man who had brought suffering to the church. Ananias struggled with this command. His battle was not between obedience and rebellion, but between fear and trust, between what his mind understood and what his spirit sensed, between the danger he saw and the purpose God revealed. This tension is familiar to anyone who has walked with God long enough. It is the space where faith becomes more than a belief. It becomes a surrender. God did not argue with Ananias. He assured him. He spoke to his heart rather than his logic. He revealed that Saul was not the threat Ananias feared, but a vessel God was preparing, a chosen instrument who would carry the gospel far beyond what anyone imagined. And in that moment, Ananias faced a choice that would alter the course of history, to remain safe or to trust God's voice above his fear. Faith that never risks anything can never be transformed into obedience. So Ananias rose, trembling but willing, uncertain but surrendered, frightened yet full of reverence for the God who had spoken his name. When Ananias stepped into the house where Saul was staying, he entered a room heavy with silence and darkness. Saul did not look like a threat anymore. He looked like a man undone, a man broken, a man waiting for something he could not name. Ananias approached him, not as a judge, not as an accuser, but as a brother. And in an act of supernatural courage, he laid his hands on the man who once hunted believers and spoke words that carried more power than any miracle Saul had witnessed. He said, "Our brother Saul, the Lord Jesus has sent me." In that moment, the cycle of fear was broken. The persecutor was welcomed. Grace entered a room that had been filled with guilt and silence. What happened next could not be explained by reason alone. Scales fell from Saul's eyes, light returned, hunger returned, breathing felt new again. But the greatest miracle was not the restoration of sight, it was the restoration of identity. God used an unknown disciple to open the eyes of the man who would one day open the eyes of nations. He used an ordinary believer to unlock an extraordinary calling. This is the beauty of God's kingdom. The world may overlook the Ananiases, but heaven entrusts them with encounters that change the trajectory of faith itself. Ananias reminds us that obedience does not require understanding, only trust. That sometimes the greatest acts of faith happen in quiet rooms, far from applause. That God chooses simple, humble hearts to participate in His deepest works. And that every believer, no matter how unseen, carries a piece of someone else's story inside their obedience. If Ananias had refused, Saul's journey would have taken a different path. But because he listened, he became the bridge between Saul's collapse and Saul's calling. Many people today underestimate the power of the role God has given them. They believe their obedience is small, their faith is unnoticed, their influence is minimal. But the truth is that God often hides His greatest works in the hands of those who do not seek recognition. Ananias did not preach to crowds. He touched one man, and that touch awakened a missionary who would touch the world. This is how God moves, through quiet people, obedient people, compassionate people, people who choose faith when fear tries to silence them. Ananias shows us that the story of Paul is not only a story of a persecutor transformed, but also a story of an ordinary believer whose courage made transformation possible. And in the stillness of that house, when Saul opened his eyes again, it was Ananias who stood beside him, a reminder that sometimes the greatest miracles come through hands no one celebrates but heaven. Paul's rebirth, a new mind, a new calling, a new purpose. When Saul opened his eyes and saw the world again, he did not rise as the same man. Something profound had shifted inside him, something far deeper than a simple change of belief. Rebirth is not the adoption of new ideas, it is the awakening of a new identity. The blindness that once trapped him had become the doorway through which a new life entered. The scales that fell from his eyes symbolized the breaking of every layer of pride, certainty, and self-sufficiency that once defined him. Saul did not simply become Paul by changing his name. He became Paul because the foundation of his soul had been rewired by the presence of Christ. The first breath Saul took after his sight returned was a breath of surrender. For the first time, he was no longer driven by the need to be right, to defend tradition, or to protect reputation. He was driven by something he had never known before: grace. Grace that confronted him, grace that restored him, grace that did not excuse his past but transformed it into testimony. Saul realized that God had not erased his story. God had rewritten it. His intelligence, once used to wound, would now be used to build. His passion, once used to destroy, would now be used to preach. His discipline, once shaped by fear, would now be fueled by love. The same fire that once burned against the church now burned for Christ Himself. This rebirth did not come without cost. Saul had to face the truth of who he had been. He had to look into the memories he once avoided. He had to accept the weight of the lives he had harmed. But instead of drowning in guilt, he discovered something that only those who truly meet Jesus understand. Grace does not erase responsibility, but it replaces condemnation with purpose. Paul's calling was forged through the painful realization that everything he once trusted had failed him. Yet God still chose him. God still called him. God still believed there was something inside him worth redeeming. This revelation marked him forever. It became the core of his preaching, the foundation of his letters, the heartbeat of his ministry. Paul's worldview collapsed and rebuilt itself around one truth: Christ is everything. Not tradition, not self-effort, not reputation, not intellect, not moral achievement. Christ alone. This shift became the lens through which he interpreted the world, the scriptures, himself, and the church. It was not theology learned from books or arguments. It was revelation born out of encounter. Paul had not simply changed beliefs. He had met a person. And once he met Jesus, nothing in his life remained the same. The transformation altered how Paul loved, how he thought, how he responded to pain, how he saw humanity, and how he understood God's heart. He no longer saw gentleness as weakness. He no longer saw mercy as compromise. He no longer saw sinners as threats, but as reflections of his former self, people in need of the same grace that rescued him. His pride melted into humility. His rigidity opened into compassion. His certainty softened into dependence. and the law he once worshipped became the tutor that led him to the one who fulfilled it. This new identity demanded a new path. Paul was no longer driven by ambition. He was led by purpose. The voice that once confronted him on the road now guided his steps. The spirit that once unsettled him now strengthened him. The love he once resisted now consumed him. And the man who once held letters to imprison believers now held letters that would one day free generations. The weight of this calling was heavy, yet Paul embraced it with a heart that had been set free from the burden of proving himself. His rebirth was not a moment. It was a process, a continuous unfolding of grace that shaped his character, mission, and message. Anyone who has experienced true transformation understands this journey. Rebirth is not the erasing of the past. It is the redeeming of it. It is God taking the pieces of who we were and crafting something new, beautiful, purposeful, and powerful from the very fragments we believed disqualified us. Paul's life teaches us that God does not call the perfect. He perfects those he calls. He does not choose the ones who impress. He chooses the ones who surrender. And in the quiet moments after his sight was restored, Paul understood that everything he would become, teacher, apostle, missionary, pillar of the faith, would flow from one truth. He had died to his old self, and Christ was now living through him. His rebirth was the birth of a legacy that would echo for centuries. The first rejection, why the church feared Paul. When Paul finally rose from the ashes of his former identity, he walked with a heart transformed, but the world around him did not change as quickly. The believers who had prayed for deliverance from Saul could not imagine that the man who once filled their homes with terror now carried a softened spirit and a humbled soul. When Paul approached the disciples for the first time, he carried no threats, no authority, no anger, only the fragile hope of belonging. Yet the doors did not open. The air grew tense. The eyes watching him were filled not with welcome, but with suspicion. For the first time in his life, Paul understood the pain of being judged before he could speak, the weight of a reputation that followed him like a shadow he could not outrun. This rejection cut deeply, not because Paul expected admiration, but because he desperately longed for forgiveness. The man who had once entered houses to tear families apart now knocked on doors asking to be received as a brother, and yet every face reminded him of his past. Every hesitant glance echoed the cries of those he had harmed. Every silence reminded him that healing takes time, even when transformation is real. Paul was experiencing a truth every believer eventually faces. Even when God forgives instantly, people often require a process. Grace is immediate, but trust grows slowly. The psychological weight of that moment cannot be underestimated. Paul had left everything behind: his career, his status, his reputation, the world he once understood, and now even the community he hoped to join kept him at a distance. He knew God had called him, but he had no idea where he belonged. This emotional disorientation is common for anyone who undergoes deep transformation. You walk out of your old life with humility, yet your new life does not fully welcome you. You are no longer who you were, but not yet fully embraced for who you are becoming. Paul found himself in this in-between space, where identity is reborn, but acceptance is delayed. Still, this painful rejection served a divine purpose. It humbled Paul even further. It stripped away any remaining dependence on human approval. It taught him that calling must be rooted in obedience, not in validation, and it revealed that transformation is not authenticated by applause, but by perseverance. God was shaping Paul's heart for a ministry that would require courage in the face of misunderstanding, steadfastness in the face of criticism, and love in the face of rejection. These early moments among the believers prepared him for the years ahead, where his message would often be met with disbelief before it inspired faith. But in this season of uncertainty, God raised a bridge. His name was Barnabas. Unlike the others, Barnabas did not look at Paul through the lens of fear. He looked at him through the lens of grace. He saw the sincerity in Paul's eyes, the tenderness in his posture, the humility in his words. Barnabas stepped forward when others stepped back. He listened when others whispered. He believed when others doubted. And with quiet courage, he placed his hand on Paul's shoulder and led him into the presence of the apostles. Barnabas became the mediator between Paul's past and his future, the voice that said, "This man has changed. This man has been touched by Jesus. This man has a calling." Without Barnabas, Paul might have walked away from the community that would later support him. Without Barnabas, Paul's early ministry might have been suffocated by suspicion. Without Barnabas, the greatest missionary the world would ever know might have spent years in isolation. This moment teaches us that while God transforms people, He often uses others to confirm that transformation. Sometimes all a person needs to move forward is for someone to believe in the work God has begun in them. Paul never forgot that moment. It shaped the tenderness we later see in his letters. It softened his tone. It deepened his compassion for those who felt rejected, misunderstood, or alone. It taught him that the gospel is not only about truth, but about the courage to embrace those whom God has restored. Rejection did not stop Paul. It refined him. Suspicion did not discourage him. It strengthened him. The doors that closed in his face prepared him for the many doors he would one day open for others. Paul's first rejection became the soil where humility, patience, and resilience took root. And in time, the same community that once feared him would come to depend on his letters, his leadership, and his wisdom. In every transformation story, there comes a moment when the past echoes louder than the present. But as Paul learned that day, God always provides a Barnabas, someone who sees the new creation, even when the world still sees the old. Paul's years in the desert, the hidden season. No one talks about. After the first rejection, after the scales fell, after the church hesitantly opened its doors, and after the shock of his transformation began to settle, Paul vanished. Not into a ministry position, not into public preaching, not into the life of influence many might expect. Instead, he disappeared into the desert of Arabia, a place of silence, heat, solitude, and stripping. Scripture mentions this season briefly, almost quietly, as if heaven hid this chapter deliberately. Yet it is here, in this hidden land of emptiness, that Paul was truly formed. Because God does not build pillars in the spotlight. He builds them in silence. The desert is where God takes a person apart so He can put them back together, without the pieces that never belonged. Paul entered Arabia carrying the wounds of his past, the weight of his guilt, the confusion of his new identity, and the echoes of the voice that had torn through his certainty on the Damascus road. He entered the desert with questions that no apostle could answer for him. What kind of man was he now? What was God calling him to do? How could he reconcile the lives he damaged with the grace he had received? Arabia became the place where these questions were allowed to breathe. There were no crowds there, no debates, no teachers, no expectations, no applause. The desert forced Paul to confront the deepest parts of himself without distraction. Silence has a way of revealing truths we hide behind noise. Solitude removes the illusions we build to protect our pride. In the emptiness of Arabia, Paul faced the truth that grace had saved him, but his soul still needed healing. The memories of the people he imprisoned, the families he fractured, the innocent faces he had watched suffer, these memories resurfaced in the quiet. And instead of running from them, Paul finally allowed God to touch them. The desert becomes sacred ground when a person stops fighting God's process. Paul had nothing left to prove. His old life was gone. His reputation was shattered. His certainty had collapsed. And for the first time, he had space to let God rebuild him from the inside out. Arabia was not punishment. It was the mercy of a God who refuses to let His children carry unresolved wounds into their calling. It was a spiritual surgery room where old motivations were cut away and new ones were established. Psychologically, this season was essential. Trauma does not disappear simply because a person encounters God. Transformation requires time, reflection, and deep inner work. Paul had spent years operating from fear, pride, and performance. Now he had to learn a new way of being, a new way of thinking, a new way of loving, a new way of surrendering. The man who once relied on his intellect now learned to rely on revelation. The man who once found strength in the law now learned to find strength in grace. The man who once trusted discipline now learned to trust the Spirit. Spiritually, Arabia was where Paul encountered God in ways no classroom could teach. It was where Christ himself became Paul's teacher, shaping his understanding of the gospel from the inside. It was where Paul received the revelations that would become the foundation of his letters, the mysteries of grace, the nature of salvation, the power of the Spirit, the unity between Jew and Gentile, the identity of the believer in Christ. Arabia was the place where the apostle was born in secret long before he emerged in public. Every calling has a desert, and many believers resist it because the desert feels like delay. But delay is not denial. Silence is not absence. Hiddenness is not rejection. Arabia is where God prepares people for assignments they cannot carry without being transformed first. Paul entered the desert with questions and left with conviction. He entered with uncertainty and left with clarity. He entered as a forgiven man and left as a called man. This hidden season refined his heart, sharpened his vision, and anchored his identity so deeply in Christ that no prison, no beating, no rejection, no storm could shake it again. When Paul finally emerged from Arabia, he was not the same man who entered. He returned with a mind renewed by revelation, a heart softened by grace, and a soul anchored in purpose. The world would one day see his strength, his letters, his courage, and his authority. But heaven knew that none of these things were born in the spotlight. They were born in the silence of a desert where God whispered truths that only the broken and surrendered can hear. This hidden chapter teaches us that the desert is not a detour. It is a birthplace, and what God forms in private, he later uses in power. The making of a pillar, Paul's transformational DNA. When Paul emerged from the desert, the world saw a man who looked familiar, but heaven saw a man who was no longer the same. Something had been forged in him that could not be shaken. His past no longer defined him. His wounds no longer controlled him. His intellect no longer ruled him. His fears no longer paralyzed him. What remained was a man stripped to the foundation, rebuilt by grace, anchored in truth, and ready to carry the weight of a calling that would reshape the future of Christianity. But this transformation was not made of emotion or momentary conviction. It was built into the very DNA of his soul. 5 internal pillars that would hold him through storms, prisons, rejections, betrayals, and spiritual battles that would break lesser men. The first pillar was emotional resilience. Paul had walked through guilt, rejection, silence, and solitude, and he emerged with a strength that did not come from suppressing pain, but from surrendering it. God had taught him how to bend without breaking, how to stand without hardening, how to endure without losing tenderness. This resilience allowed him to write words of hope while chained to prison walls, to sing hymns in the dark, and to encourage churches while his own body bore the marks of suffering. Emotional resilience is not learned on mountaintops. It is forged in valleys, and Paul had walked through enough valleys to carry a strength the early church desperately needed. The second pillar was intellectual humility. Paul had once built his life on knowledge, credentials, arguments, and reputation. But in meeting Christ, he discovered that knowledge without revelation is blindness dressed as wisdom. In the desert, pride was broken, and humility took its place. This humility allowed him to admit when he was wrong, to submit to the apostles he once opposed, to learn from believers he once despised, and to receive correction without resentment. His brilliance did not disappear. It was redeemed. He no longer used knowledge to elevate himself, but to elevate Christ. It was this humility that made him teachable enough for God to entrust him with mysteries that would shape the faith for centuries. The third pillar was radical dependence on grace. Paul understood better than anyone that he did not deserve his calling. He knew the depth of his past sins, the weight of the blood he carried, the memories he would never forget. But instead of drowning in shame, he allowed grace to define him. This gave him a boldness that did not come from self-confidence, but from God-confidence. A confidence rooted in the truth that his strength and worthiness did not come from his performance, but from Christ living within him. This dependence fueled his passion, guided his decisions, and protected him from falling back into the chains of legalism. The fourth pillar was courage rooted in calling. Paul had faced more danger than any apostle of his time. prisons, beatings, shipwrecks, riots, betrayals, rejection from believers and unbelievers alike. Yet he never retreated. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that obedience matters more than fear. Paul understood that his calling was not a choice. It was a divine assignment sealed by Christ himself. This awareness turned him into an unstoppable force, not reckless, not impulsive, but steady, determined, and willing to walk into danger because he knew who walked with him. The fifth pillar was the capacity to suffer with purpose. Suffering had once been something Paul inflicted on others. Now it became something he endured for the sake of Christ. But he did not suffer bitterly. He suffered with meaning. He suffered with revelation. He suffered with joy because he understood that every wound he carried was shaping him into the image of the one he followed. This gave him the strength to keep preaching, praying, and traveling, even when his body was broken and his spirit was exhausted. The man who once caused suffering now used his own to strengthen the church. These 5 pillars, resilience, humility, grace, courage, and purpose, formed the core of who Paul would become. They were not gifts. They were forged. They were the result of encounters, collapses, wounds, questions, forgiveness, silence, and revelation. They made him a pillar not because he sought greatness, but because he surrendered deeply enough for God to build greatness within him. Paul's strength did not come from being extraordinary. It came from being surrendered. The world remembers him as a giant, but heaven remembers him as a man who let God reshape his soul one layer at a time. And in that transformation, the foundation of Christian theology and spiritual maturity was born. The world turned upside down, Paul's legacy on the mind and soul. When Paul stepped into his calling, the world around him had no idea what was coming. They saw a man once feared now walking with humility, a former persecutor now preaching the very Christ he tried to silence. But heaven saw something far greater. Heaven saw a vessel carrying revelations that would shake nations, reshape theology, and redefine what it meant to know God. Paul did not simply travel across cities. He traveled across spiritual walls. He tore down barriers between Jew and Gentile. He opened the doors of faith to people who once thought God was beyond their reach. He wrote words that would echo through centuries, not because he sought influence, but because his life had become a river of truth, flowing from encounter, surrender, and transformation. Paul's legacy was not built on eloquence, intelligence, or charisma. It was built on revelation. Revelation born from the desert, from silence, from struggle, and from grace. His letters were not academic texts. They were the cries of a man who had wrestled with his own soul and emerged with a clarity that could only come from the Spirit. Every word carried weight because every word came from a heart that had been broken and rebuilt by God. He spoke of grace with the authority of someone who had been rescued. He spoke of the Spirit with the intimacy of someone who had been guided. He spoke of suffering with the wisdom of someone who had endured. And he spoke of Christ with the passion of someone who had met him face to face. Paul understood the human mind in ways few people ever have. He understood the battle between flesh and spirit, the tension between fear and faith, the pull of old patterns, and the war within the self. His writings expose the psychological layers of the human experience: identity, shame, pride, desire, weakness, resilience. And he connected these layers not to human solutions, but to divine intervention. He taught that the renewing of the mind is not a motivational concept. It is a spiritual rebirth, a restructuring of thought shaped by surrender, guided by truth, and sustained by grace. Paul knew the soul's fractures because he had lived them. He knew what it meant to hate what is wrong, yet feel powerless to change. He knew the torment of guilt and the weight of regret. He knew the confusion of wanting to do good while still battling old shadows. This is why his words speak with such emotional authenticity. When he wrote about weakness becoming strength, he wrote from wounds that had been healed. When he wrote about perseverance, he wrote from prisons, from lashes, from storms that nearly killed him. When he wrote about joy, he wrote from a spirit no circumstance could imprison. Paul's life was not theory, it was testimony. But his legacy did not end with personal transformation. It reshaped the early church. Paul taught believers that they were not defined by their past, but by their position in Christ. He taught communities that unity was possible not because people were alike, but because the Spirit was one. He taught that freedom was not the absence of struggle, but the presence of grace. He taught that love was not a feeling, but a discipline. And he taught that suffering, when surrendered to God, produces endurance, character, and hope. Paul turned the world upside down, not by overthrowing governments, but by transforming hearts. His message traveled farther than his feet ever could. His letters became the framework for Christian doctrine. His teachings became the foundation for spiritual growth. His life became the evidence that no one is beyond God's reach. Even today, his words heal minds, restore faith, convict hearts, and strengthen weary souls. Scholars analyze them, churches preach them, believers memorize them, and the broken cling to them in the darkest nights. Yet perhaps the most powerful part of Paul's legacy is this: he never forgot who he had been. His humility was not manufactured, it was born from memory. He remembered the road to Damascus. He remembered the darkness. He remembered the voice. And because he remembered, he walked with a tenderness that softened his strength, a compassion that shaped his authority, and a dependence that kept him anchored. His life teaches us that true spiritual power comes not from perfection, but from surrender. Paul's legacy lives today not because he was extraordinary, but because he allowed God to be extraordinary through him. And the world has never been the same. The real message: if God transformed Paul, he can transform you. When we arrive at the end of Paul's story, we are not simply looking at the life of a man who changed. We are looking at the depth of a God who rescues, a God who interrupts, a God who rewrites stories no matter how far they have drifted from him. Paul's life stands as a living testimony that no heart is too hard, no past too dark, no mind too stubborn, and no soul too wounded for God to reach. If God could touch Saul, the angry zealot, the feared persecutor, the man who carried blood on his hands, and turn him into Paul, the compassionate teacher and apostle of grace, then the same God can touch any life, any story, any wound, and any heart that dares to open before him. Paul's journey is not meant to be admired from a distance. It is meant to become a mirror for every believer who feels unworthy, broken, or beyond redemption. His story reminds us that transformation is not the product of effort, discipline, or willpower. It is the result of surrender. Saul did not transform himself. He was overtaken by grace. Grace met him on a road he never expected. Grace knocked him to the ground, not to break him, but to awaken him. Grace stripped him of vision so God could rebuild his life with new sight. And the same grace still moves today, reaching into places where shame hides, where fear whispers, where guilt suffocates, and where pride blinds. There is a part of Saul in every human being, the part that clings to old beliefs because change feels terrifying, the part that hides behind logic because vulnerability feels dangerous, the part that tries to control life because trust feels too risky, the part that resists God, not because we do not want him, but because we fear what he might ask of us. Yet God does not move with force. He moves with love. He calls our name the way he called Saul, not to expose our failures, but to reveal his mercy, not to crush our pride, but to free us from it, not to shame us, but to bring us home. The same Jesus who confronted Saul confronts you, not with anger, but with invitation. He whispers into the fractured spaces of your soul, asking the same question that changed Saul's life forever. Why are you running from me? This question is not accusation. It is grace searching for an open door. It is love reaching into your hidden fears. It is truth gently touching the places where you feel unworthy. And when you respond, when you finally stop resisting, your story begins to shift. Your blindness begins to lift. Your heart begins to soften. The places you thought were dead begin to breathe again. Paul's transformation teaches us that God works most deeply in silence, in the moments when answers do not come, in the seasons where you feel blind, lost, or suspended between the person you were and the person you are becoming. Saul had 3 days of darkness. You may have 3 months or 3 years. But the timing of God is not delay. It is preparation. God never wastes a season of silence. He uses it to rebuild you, to free you, to cleanse you, and to prepare you for the purpose He shaped before you were even born. And when the moment comes, when God places His hands on your soul, the way He used the hands of Ananias to touch Paul, scales fall, shame falls, fear falls, old mindsets fall. Every lie the enemy used to imprison you begins to lose its power. And in that sacred moment, you rise different. You rise whole. You rise with purpose. You rise with a new identity that no past can erase. This is the message hidden inside Paul's story. Transformation is possible for anyone who meets Christ. Not a gentle adjustment, not a small improvement, but a rebirth so deep that even your enemies would struggle to recognize you. God wants to do in you what He did in Paul, not because you are strong, but because He is merciful. Not because you deserve it, but because He is love. And when His grace touches your life, the world around you will see the evidence. So pause for a moment. Let these truths settle. Let your heart open. Let your soul breathe. If God transformed Saul, He can transform you. If He rewrote his story, He can rewrite yours. If He found Saul on a dusty road far from mercy, He can find you right where you are. This is not the end of the teaching. It is the beginning of a calling, a whisper of God inviting you into deeper faith, deeper surrender, and deeper intimacy with Him. And now, as Paul did on the day his world changed, you too can ask the most powerful question a human soul can speak. Lord, what do you want me to do? Because the moment you ask that question, heaven begins to move.